Ready to open the hood? UseTool for the tutorials.
And for car parts, the right idea is the Mr. Auto app. Easy, fast, and with better prices than on the website.
You will find the sash shock absorbers used in the video through the link in the description. Turn your engine off, pull up the handbrake, pull on the bonnet release lever and open the bonnet. To access the shock absorber's head on the passenger side, you need to remove the metal protection plate of the diesel filter. Using a ratchet and a 13mm socket, unscrew the screw and the two nuts holding the plate. Remove the protection plate and move the diesel filter. Using the same tools, unscrew the two screws of the diesel filter holding plate, as well as the two nuts. Using a flathead screwdriver, remove the windscreen bay cover, which will help you to access the third screw on the shock absorber head. Then, using a ratchet and a 13mm socket, unscrew the three screws holding the shock absorber strut support bearing by a few threads in order to create some play for the next manipulations. In order to change the front shock absorbers on your vehicle, you must lift the front of the car and remove the wheels to have complete access to the suspension system. Loosen the stud bolts on the front wheels. Raise the front of the vehicle and put it in the two-axle stance. We strongly suggest watching the tutorial, raising your vehicle safely before carrying out this step. You will then be able to take off the wheels. Don't forget to slide them under the vehicle. To be able to change this kind of shock absorber, you have to separate the control arm and the cardan shaft from the stub axle. Use pliers to remove the safety pin and the metal cover. To unscrew the hub lock nut, you have to stop the disc rotating. To do this, insert a thin flathead screwdriver between the two sides of the disc. You have to insert it in front of the brake caliper mount so that it butts up against the latter. With an iron bar and a 32mm socket, unscrew the nut on the hub, then remove it. During this operation, you will be working on the front axle of your car, so it is advisable to perform a parallelism afterwards. Use a Torx T30 spanner to loosen the disc retaining screw. For this operation, we advise you to remove the entire braking system, including the disc. This will give you easier access to the various components and also considerably reduce the weight of the axle stub. To do this, we recommend watching the video How to Replace the Front Brake Discs and Pads Qashqai 2. Now, you have to remove the outer tie rod from the axle stub. To do this, we recommend watching the video How to Replace the Outer Rod Qashqai 2. You now have to remove the stabilizer link bar. To do this, we recommend watching the video How to Replace the Sway Bar Link Qashqai 2. Here's a tip. Attach a piece of electrical cable or a piece of string to one of the coils of the suspension spring. To avoid damaging the brake hose, attach it to the suspension using the cable you have already attached. It is now time to remove the ball joint from the control arm of the stub axle. To do this, brush the nut and spray it with degreaser. Then, using a 16mm spanner, a ratchet and a 16mm socket, unscrew the ball joint retaining screw. Then, remove the screw. You may want to use a drift punch to remove it. Finish unscrewing the hub screw. Then, remove it. In order to remove the control arms more easily, hold the front axle in position with the support of a jack position at the hub. Use a crowbar to remove the ball joint from the control arm of the stub axle. You can now remove the cardan shaft from the stub axle. Remove the retaining clip from the brake hose. Detach the caliper and place it on an elevated surface. Disconnect the ABS sensor plug. Then detach the cable from its clips. Brush the screw of the shock absorber base and spray it with degreaser. Then, using a ratchet, an 18-gauge socket and an 18-gauge spanner, unscrew the nut on the shock mount. Then remove the screw. You can use a drift punch to remove it. Brush the base of the shock absorber, then spray it with degreaser. This will facilitate the following steps. On this vehicle, we advise you to disengage the axle stubs from the shock absorber once the shock absorber is detached in order to avoid damaging the ball joint of the control arms. Using a ratchet, a 13mm socket and a 13mm spanner, complete the loosening of the 3 screws holding the shock absorber. Once unlocked, hold the shock absorber with one hand and finish unscrewing with the other. Put the shock absorber to the side. Clamp the damper in a vise. Using a hammer, slide a thin chisel into the opening of the stub axle at the shock absorber base. This will create a slight opening to help you remove the shock absorber with ease. Hit the axle stub to release the shock absorber base. In order to change the shock absorber, you must now separate it from the spring. Position the damper in the vise. Then, tighten the damper compressors. Check that they're properly held by the locking studs, then slowly compress the spring using the socket wrench and the appropriate socket. You can find a description of the tool used in the video, which we think is most adapted to the operation. Careful, pay attention as you compress the spring. This is not without risk and should be undertaken paying very careful attention. Once the shock absorber is free in the spring, using an 18mm Allen key and a 6mm spanner, loosen the shock absorber mount. In the most extreme cases, you have to use an impact wrench. You can also use the specific tool used in the video, which will make your task much easier. Then remove the strut mount assembly, the sleeve stop assembly with a spring. Recover the lower spring retainer.
Hi, it's Theo from UseTool. I hope this video has helped you a lot in your car maintenance. We will be super grateful if you could spread the word so that we can produce even more tutorials. Simply give us a like, a comment, and hit that subscribe button. It really helps us boost the channel and help the whole community. Thanks a lot and have a great one.
You will find the sash parts and products used in the video in the link in the description. Before installing the new shock absorbers, it is necessary to prime them by pressing the shock absorber rod vertically so that the gas and the hydraulic fluid are separated. Take the new shock absorber. Unscrew the lug nut on the stem. Then install the lower shock absorber support. Reinstall the shock absorber stop. Install the spring on the shock absorber, making sure that the spring is resting on the bottom shock absorber stop. Then install the shock absorber sleeve, the shock absorber mount, and finish by screwing the shock absorber rod nut back on, first by hand, then tighten it firmly using the tools. Unscrew the spring compression tool, paying attention to the position of the spring on the lower shock absorber support. You have now finished preparing the new part. Sand and grease the inside of the stub axle to help facilitate the reinsertion of the shock absorber. Go ahead and lightly grease the shock absorber base. You can do this also on the location of the ball joint of the control arms to facilitate the installation. position the shock absorber base at the entrance of the axle stub. Then, use a hammer to push the shock absorber into the axle stub. The bottom positioning pin of the shock absorber foot must be inserted into the opening of the stub axle. Push the shock absorber in until the tab comes to a rest. Roughly, tighten the screw on the strut support bearing. Tighten the shock absorber base bolt with a Torx spanner. Insert the shock absorber starting from the top part. Tighten the 3 screws on the shock head by a few threads. Brush, then lightly grease the cotton shaft. Then insert the cotton shaft into the stub axle. While holding the assembly together, apply pressure on the control arms with a crowbar so that you have enough room to thread the ball joint of the control arms into the axle stub. You can use a jack and a hammer to tap the ball joint until it's fully engaged. Once in place, screw the screws back in, roughly by hand. Finish off the tightening with a torque wrench. Clip the ABS sensor hose back in. Then reconnect it. Put the sway bar link back in place. Then screw it back on. Finish off the tightening with a torque wrench. Replace the ball joint in the pivot. Then roughly screw it back on. Then loosely screw the cotton shaft bolt back in to hold it together. Put the brake system back in place. To do this, we recommend watching the video How to Replace the Front Brake Discs and Pads, Qashqai 2. Clip the brake hose back in. Repeat the screwdriver technique to block the rotation of the disc so that you can lock the hub nut of the disc. Finish off the tightening with a torque wrench. Put the metal cover back in place, then the security lock. Tighten the outer tie rod with a Torx spanner. Put the wheels of your vehicle back on and lower it to the ground. The final tightening of the 3 bolts holding the shock absorber mount is to be finished when the vehicle is on the ground. Finalize the tightening of the shock absorber head with a torque wrench. Reinstall the fuel filter retaining plate, the diesel filter protection plate. Operation completed.
Hi, it's Theo from UseTool. I hope this video has helped you a lot in your car maintenance. We will be super grateful if you could spread the word so that we can produce even more tutorials. Simply give us a like, a comment, and hit that subscribe button. It really helps us boost the channel and help the whole community. Thanks a lot and have a great one.